Welcome back to the Homestyle MMA Podcast. Sean Van Buren here for episode 25. Shout out to all the listeners or homies checking this out right now. I appreciate all of you. Today we're talking about the upcoming UFC Fight Night, Rodriguez versus Lemos. Before we dive into that, it's time for the rapid recap of last Saturday, UFC Fight Night Kattar versus Allen. Let's go. Fairly odd night of fights, some strange judging, surprising finishes, and unfortunate ending to our main event. Let's dive into this rapid recap, starting with Christian Rodriguez versus Joshua Weems. Weems started off pretty well, and he actually outstruck Rodriguez, but Christian Rodriguez stayed composed and took what came to him from Weems. Weems got a takedown, he was a bit lazy with it and lazy on the ground, and Christian Rodriguez used an anaconda choke grip to flip Weems off of him and lock in the first round submission win. One careless mistake from Joshua Weems cost him this fight. Cody Durden versus Carlos Mota. Not the most exciting fight because Carlos Mota really couldn't handle himself well on the ground. Durden landed 4 takedowns but had over 12 minutes of total control time across the 15 minutes of this fight. With only 39 total significant strikes, this fight was not the most thrilling for fans checking it out. Regardless, a win is a win for Cody Durden. Chase Hooper versus Steve Garcia. Man, this fight caught the world by surprise. Chase Hooper has been growing up in the octagon, and we expected him to take a step forward in this fight. Steve Garcia had other plans. Garcia moved down to featherweight from lightweight, and his power at this lighter weight class was on display. The power left hand from Steve Garcia just kept finding its mark, dropping Chase Hooper 3 times, and eventually for the first round knockout win. I told you last week that Jun Young Park was a very well-balanced MMA fighter, and we saw that when he took on Joseph Holmes. He was sharp on the feet, but even better with his wrestling and on the ground. Park had 2 official submission attempts, but eventually found the finish in the second round via rear naked choke submission. Fairly dominant performance for Jun Young Park against tough competition with Joseph Holmes. This is giving Holmes his first submission loss of his career as well. Marcos Rogerio de Lima versus Andrei Arlovsky was as one-sided as a fight could get. I was very confident in Marcos Rogerio de Lima, and I wish that I had put 2 units on that confidence. Rogerio de Lima scored a fast knockdown, jumped on Arlovsky, and finished this fight via rear naked choke for a fast submission win in under 2 minutes. Almost perfect performance from Rogerio de Lima, and this was a tough defeat for the veteran Andrei Arlovsky. Phil Hawes versus Roman Dolidze followed that, and I expect this to be a very tough fight, but Dolidze came out on top with the first round knockout win. I did think that these fighters were tough enough to go over 1.5 rounds, but I told you last week that I knew this fight would end by knockout. I did think it would be late though. This does make 3 wins in a row for Roman Dolidze, with his only loss occurring in the UFC seemingly being a fluke against what now appears to be a lesser fighter. Dustin Jacoby versus Khalil Rountree Jr. was the fight that had folks puzzled. The judges gave the split decision to Khalil Rountree Jr., and this is a fight where you needed to look at it as damage over volume. Truthfully, I still thought that Dustin Jacoby won this fight. He had 120 significant strikes versus just 85 by Khalil Rountree Jr. Rountree Jr. landed maybe the larger damaging strikes, I'll give him that, but I think you also need to weigh how much damage volume striking can cause. They threw about the same number of significant strikes as well, but Rountree Jr. didn't land nearly as many. Jacoby landed 1.5 times as many significant strikes as Rountree Jr., and I think Dustin Jacoby should have won this fight. Josh Fremd versus Tresean Gore made us forget about that strange decision right away. This fight was wild. Josh Fremd was winning this fight through the first round with sharp striking, and it was the second round that Tresean Gore decided to flip this fight on its head. In the second round, Tresean Gore caught Fremd in a guillotine choke and started to absolutely crank on his neck. He put so much torque into this guillotine choke that he actually put Josh Fremd to sleep in the second round. Waldo Cortez Acosta versus Jared Vanderaa. This fight caught me off guard a little bit. I expected much more volume striking from Jared Vanderaa, but he never quite flipped the switch that he needed in this fight. Waldo Cortez Acosta beat him in a stand-up fight. I told you last week that they would stay standing in this war. I didn't anticipate any takedowns, and Cortez Acosta made sure to do just enough to beat Vanderaa on the scorecards. Tim Means versus Max Griffin was a good fight. Max Griffin got the split decision win in what was really actually a very good fight, for being honest. It was a very close fight, and kind of interesting when you look at the statistics for this one as well. Griffin had 3 takedowns with 5 minutes of control time and a knockdown, but Tim Means landed 143 total strikes compared to just 56 for Griffin, almost 100 more strikes. This fight was about impact. The knockdown, takedowns, and control time were much more significant in this fight than the little strikes that Tim Means would throw from time to time trying to score. I think the judges actually got this one right, and Max Griffin got back to his winning ways, having won 4 of his last 5 fights. That took us to our main event fight, Calvin Kattar versus Arnold Allen, this was just a real letdown. I think we were all really looking forward to this fight. These are very high-level featherweight fighters, and the ending just was not satisfying. Calvin Kattar is an outstanding fighter. He unfortunately suffered a knee injury in this fight very early on. There have been so many strange injuries that have ended fights this year, and we can add this fight to the list. Calvin Kattar jumped for a flying knee, trying to land it to the head of Arnold Allen, but Allen sidestepped the knee, and when Kattar was returning back to the ground after throwing the flying knee, he just kind of landed awkwardly on his leg. You could see the knee kind of buckle when he landed, and as the fight went on, you could see the knee continuing to give out and possibly tear further. The ref called an end to this fight in round 2 via TKO. Arnold Allen got the win in what we hoped would be a lengthy war between these highly ranked fighters. Unfortunately, we had the injury, which made that not the case. But for Arnold Allen, that does technically make 12 wins in a row. And honestly, even 11 in a row is very impressive. But with those 12 wins in a row, 10 of them have occurred in the UFC. He is on the short list for a title shot very soon. And unfortunately for Calvin Kattar, he's going to need some time to heal up that knee, possibly get surgery, and hopefully we can see him return to the octagon later in the summer of 2023. Hopefully around maybe July or so, but this will probably be a long rehab for him. That wraps up our rapid recap. Let's take a look at our bets. Yikes, everybody. Tough night of bets again. We'd strung together a few great weekends, but we crashed back down to earth hard in this one. We went for a lot of underdog bets on this last Saturday, and now in hindsight, I guess we shouldn't have. Starts us off with Christian Rodriguez versus Joshua Weems. We had Joshua Weems moneyline plus 290 is a big underdog loss to start the night. Cody Durden versus Carlos Mota. I liked Cody Durden, but we did not bet it. Chase Hooper versus Steve Garcia. Chase Hooper by finish plus 125 was a loss. Huge loss, really, because Steve Garcia absolutely dominated that fight. Joseph Holmes versus Jung Young Park. We had Joseph Holmes moneyline plus 200 for a loss. Andre Arlovsky versus Marcos Rogerio de Lima. I was very confident Marcos Rogerio de Lima would win that fight at minus 230 for the win. And the Phil Hawes versus Roman Dolidze fight. We didn't bet, and I actually should have, but didn't give you guys which way I was leaning on that one, so we'll just leave that as is. That takes us to our UFC main card with Dustin Jacoby versus Khalil Roundtree Jr. We had Dustin Jacoby moneyline minus 167, what I think should have been a win, but unfortunately was a loss for us. Josh Fremd versus Tresean Gore. Josh Fremd moneyline minus 165 was looking great until Tresean Gore decided to crank that neck and get a submission win for the loss for us. Waldo Cortez Acosta versus Jared Vanderaa. I just like Jared Vanderaa. We took him at plus 175 underdog for a loss. I felt that he had to win to stay in the UFC. Because he didn't get that win, I don't know. We'll have to see what happens to him here. Tim Means versus Max Griffin. Max Griffin moneyline minus 185 was a win. And Calvin Kattar versus Arnold Allen over 3.5 rounds as a 2-unit going back for more bet at minus 182 was an unfortunate loss for us with the early knee injury to Calvin Kattar. Tough Saturday, down 7 units. We went 3-7. Another really rough betting weekend for us in the UFC. I really didn't have these very often when I didn't have a podcast, but of course, now that we are podcasting, we have these crazy bad weekends that I just, I guess it happens. This is why it's called gambling, but I definitely did not anticipate this happening this past Saturday. We're going back for more bets, went 0 for 1 as well, but that takes us into the Homestyle Perfect Plate Parlay. Close with this one, but it is what it is. We had Chase Hooper money line, which obviously busted the parlay. Marcos Rogerio de Lima money line and Max Griffin money line for a plus 208. And again, it lost due to that disappointing performance from Chase Hooper with his first round knockout loss. That wraps up our betting from this past Saturday. Let's leave it behind us, review how we did on verdict, give out some awards, and keep moving it forward. For the first time since the creation of this podcast, we went back-to-back weekends without a verdict medal. Definitely don't want to do that again in the future. We were close, but no luck here. Out of the 5 fights on verdict, we only picked the last 2 fights with the correct winners, but we did put 600 of our total 1,000 experience points into those fights. So we were very close to a medal, but we fell just short, and we'll look to get back on the leaderboard this upcoming Saturday. For the Homestyle MMA Podcast Awards, we start off with the Mac and Cheese UFC Prelims Performance of the Night. That can go to no one else but Steve Garcia, with his really impressive underdog knockout win over Chase Hooper, where he had 3 total knockdowns in under 2 minutes of action. Spectacular fight for him, easy pick for our prelim performance of the night. Our Chicken and Dumplings UFC main card performance of the night, I'm giving that to Tresean Gore. He was really getting beat pretty bad in the first round, and out of nowhere, he caught this guillotine choke and decided it was boom or bust. He was putting all his strength into that choke. It was one of the deepest guillotine submission chokes that we've seen in the UFC. He created so much torque on the neck that he got the submission win, put his opponent to sleep. Very impressive and very deserving of a Homestyle MMA Podcast award. That wraps up the entirety of our last Saturday in the UFC. Let's look forward to UFC Fight Night Rodriguez versus Lemos. The UFC Fight Night Rodriguez versus Lemos prelims are going to start at 4:00 p.m. Eastern Time with Tamires Vidal versus Ramona Pascual. Pascual is making her 4th MMA appearance in 2022, 3rd for the UFC, but is yet to win for the organization. Tamires Vidal is on a 5-fight win streak and is making her UFC debut. In each of Pascual's 2 UFC appearances, she's been severely outstruck by her opponents but got to the end of the 15 minutes in each fight. Tamires Vidal has faced elite-level competition outside of the UFC. She's faced 2 fighters currently on the roster and a 3rd that fights for the PFL. She's only lost to one of them, and I think Tamires Vidal will get the win here, possibly by submission. Carlos Candelario versus Jake Hadley. Carlos won a unanimous decision on Dana White's Contender Series Season 1 back in 2017, but didn't get a spot on the roster. He then lost a split decision on Dana White's Contender Series Season 5 last year, and his UFC debut earlier this year. His last 4 fights have all gone to a decision as well. Jake Hadley won a fight in Bellator, then 2 in Cage Warriors, then a submission win on Dana White's Contender Series last year, and finally had his first loss of his career in his UFC debut in his last fight. He's finished 6 of his 8 wins, and Jake Hadley wins this fight. Plain and simple, here's the deal. Carlos Candelario wants to wrestle, he's been outstruck in his losses, but Hadley is happy to go for submissions. I think Hadley will win on the feet, then threaten multiple submission attempts on the ground when Candelario takes him down. Ludwig Sholinian versus Johnny Munoz. Ludwig is 0-2 in the UFC, both by decision and both against pretty good competition. Munoz lost his UFC debut, but won his next fight by submission, then was knocked out in the first round in his last fight. Johnny Munoz is a very aggressive wrestler, and I see no reason for him to change his natural tendencies in this fight. Ludwig was aggressively wrestled to losses in his first 2 fights, and I think that will happen again here. Poliana Viana versus Jin Yu Frey. Viana has finished all 12 of her professional wins, with 8 by submission. On the other side of the octagon, Jinyu Frey is a decision fighter with her past 4 fights going to judges' scorecards. I just think that this is a bad matchup for Jinyu Frey. I think Poliana Viana will be better as a striker and significantly better on the ground in this matchup. Look for Viana to get a finish, possibly early in this fight on the ground by submission. Mario Bautista versus Benito Lopez. Lopez has a 4-inch reach advantage in what should be a very exciting fight. He won his last fight and is 2-1 in the UFC, and even won a spot on the roster on Dana White's Contender Series. Bautista is on a 2-fight win streak, he's 4-2 in the UFC, and he's more of a stand-up striking style fighter with an aggressive leg kick attack. Benito Lopez has yet to go for a takedown in the UFC, and his wrestling will be tested against Mario Bautista, who averages 2.17 takedowns per fight. I just see Bautista's wrestling being a problem in this one. I think he will take down Benito Lopez multiple times, string together a lot of control time, and grind out a win. Miranda Maverick versus Shayna Young was rebooked for this upcoming Saturday and was previously scheduled. Shayna Young is 4 inches taller and they have similar reach advantage. Miranda Maverick is 3-2 in the UFC and is coming off of a submission win. She's never been finished as a pro. With a Muay Thai background, she actually has 7 submission victories out of her 12 professional MMA fights, so she's very well-rounded. Shayna Young is 1-2 in the UFC and is coming off of a knockout victory. Shayna is 3-2 by submission, and Miranda is 7-0 by submission. In Young's 2 losses, she gave up 5 out of 12 takedowns for around 12 total minutes of control time through 4.5 rounds. Miranda Maverick went 4 for 7, with 4 minutes of control time in her second round submission win last time out. I think that this is a clear path to victory for Miranda Maverick. Look for her to get a few takedowns early and finish this fight on the ground, possibly very early on again in under 1.5 rounds. Derek Minor versus Shaylon Nordonbiek. Minor doesn't hide what he's trying to do in the octagon. He wants to win with jiu-jitsu, and he has done a lot of that in his career. He has 22 submission wins out of his 26 total professional MMA wins. He plays with fire, though, as he has also been submitted 8 times and been knocked out 3 times. 34 of his 39 total pro fights have ended by finish. Shaylon is on a 2-fight win streak and is 2-1 in the UFC. He can get it done all kinds of different ways, but he also has been in many fights. With 38 professional wins, he has 18 knockouts and 10 submissions. He too has been on the wrong side of some finishes, however, with 2 knockout losses and 6 submission losses. All these stats to say, one thing is certain, this fight will not go to the judges. With all 3 of Shaylon's UFC fights having gone to decisions, Minor is also a very aggressive finishing fighter, and he's willing to take chances to try to get finishes in these fights. I think Shaylon gets the win here just because he's a more well-rounded MMA fighter. He will be better in the striking, he can wrestle well, and he can play the ground game well. With Derek Minor on a 2-fight losing streak, I think he will gamble a bit more late in this fight to try to find a win that will ultimately lead to his demise. That wraps up our UFC prelims. Let's take a look at the UFC main card. The UFC main card starts at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time with Grant Dawson versus Mark O. Madsen. Unfortunately, we lost the Jailton Almeida versus Max Grishin fight. That was removed from this upcoming Saturday. So we started off with Grant Dawson versus Marco Madsen, which is also a great fight. This will be a wrestling dominant fight. Dawson is on a 10-fight unbeaten streak with 6 UFC wins. Marco Madsen is 12-0 as a pro with 4 UFC wins. Both fighters use wrestling and ground and pound to control and win fights. Dawson does have 12 submission wins, however, out of his 18 professional wins, and that may be the difference in this fight. Both guys want to wrestle, but Dawson has the advantage in jiu-jitsu once it gets to the ground. I think that they may be pretty even on the feet, but Marco Madsen may have the slightest power advantage. Expect this to potentially be a fight of the night. I anticipate a great battle going for at least 1.5 rounds, with Grant Dawson giving Mark O. Madsen his first professional loss. Tagir Ulanbekov versus Nate Maness follows that up, with Maness being 3 inches taller and 2 inches longer in reach. Maness lost his last fight, but previously won his first 3 UFC fights. Ulanbekov is in a similar situation, having lost his last fight, but won his first 2 UFC fights as well. Ulanbekov will use a wrestling-heavy attack, and therefore will need to get inside the reach distance of Nate Maness. The wrestling is just bad news for Nate Maness. In his last UFC appearance loss, Nate Maness was wrestled and controlled for over 10 minutes of that fight. This is just a bad stylistic matchup for Nate Maness. He's struggled with wrestling in the past, and I don't see any reason for that trend to change in this fight. Tagir Ulanbekov is going to wrestle his way to a decision victory. Next up, we have the big boys with Chase Sherman versus Josh Parisian. Heavyweight power will be on display. Both similarly massive, 26 of their combined 31 pro wins have been by knockout. I think someone's going to sleep here. Sherman ended his 4-fight losing streak with a knockout win in his last fight. He was in an absolute slugfest in that fight, with each fighter landing over 100 significant strikes. Parisian won his last fight and he's 3-2 in the UFC. He did get knocked down in his last fight, but battled back to get the knockout win himself. This will be a very interesting fight. Do not blink. I think Sherman has the power advantage on the feet and can sleep Parisian with one good punch, but Parisian does utilize wrestling with his attack, and I think he can really control Chase Sherman if the fight hits the mats. Either way, I think someone is going to sleep. I can see Chase Sherman knocking out Parisian as he goes for a takedown, or Parisian getting a knockout ground and pound win. Right now, I'm leaning Josh Parisian to get the win here, but this fight will be intense. No chance we go to the judges' scorecards, so make sure you do not blink or you might miss that one shot that ends this fight. Next up is Neil Magny versus Daniel Rodriguez. Number 13 ranked welterweight Magny is 2 inches taller and has 6 inches in reach advantage. Number 14 ranked welterweight D-Rod relies mostly on striking and kickboxing to win fights, while Neil Magny is not afraid to get dirty on the ground. Magny lost his last fight, but had won 5 of his last 6 before that. Daniel Rodriguez is on a 4-fight win streak, but was in a very close split decision win for his last fight. He uses a lot of leg kicks, which can open him up for takedowns, however. I think Neil Magny gets another win here. I think D-Rod will have just a slight advantage on the feet, but Magny's wrestling will get him the win in this one with more than 5 completed takedowns across 15 minutes of action. Speaking of 15 minutes, I think this one likely goes long as well. Over 1.5 rounds for sure, and likely the distance. 5 of D-Rod's 8 UFC fights have gone to a decision, and 6 of Magny's 7 have gone to decisions as well. I think Neil Magny will do enough on the feet with his jab length advantage, and then grind down Rodriguez on the ground for a decision win. I don't think Magny can finish Rodriguez, but D-Rod does have a puncher's chance to knock out Neil Magny, although I do think that is unlikely. That takes us to our UFC main event. Our UFC main event finds us with Marina Rodriguez versus Amanda Lemos in what is a huge strawweight fight. I think if number 3 ranked strawweight Marina Rodriguez wins, her next fight will be for the belt, and number 7 ranked strawweight Amanda Lemos needs to probably win this fight, and probably her next one will be a title eliminator fight. So she's 2 wins away from another title shot herself. Marina is an electrifying striker. She throws a ton of volume strikes in her fights, and this is her 3rd main event, with the previous 2 both going the full 5 rounds. This is the 2nd main event for Amanda Lemos, but she lost her first one by first round submission. Lemos has a lot of power with her strikes, but I don't think she can keep up with the volume of Marina Rodriguez. I think Marina Rodriguez will win this fight. I think this fight will go long as well, because Marina doesn't quite have as much finishing power, and she prefers to keep fights on the feet. Amanda Lemos will have the advantage in the ground game, but Rodriguez is pretty tough to take down, so I don't think Amanda Lemos will get many opportunities to try to end this fight on the ground. I think the strikes will start to really stack up for Marina as the fight goes on as well, and I could see her winning rounds 4-1. Ultimately, I think that Marina Rodriguez and Lemos will split the first 2 rounds, and then as the volume striking of Marina Rodriguez starts to add up, I could see her winning rounds 3, 4, and 5. That wraps up our UFC analysis for this upcoming Saturday. Let's dive into the bets that we'll be making this weekend. Look at our bets. Obviously, we want to do a little bit better than we did last weekend. As always, please bet responsibly. If you have a gambling problem, call your state's hotline. We start off with Tamirez Vidal versus Ramona Pascual. We're taking Tamirez Vidal moneyline -140. Carlos Candelario versus Jake Hadley. We're going Jake Hadley moneyline -275. Ludwig Jolinian versus Johnny Munoz. We're going Johnny Munoz moneyline -245. Going back for more 2-unit bet. Poliana Viana versus Jinyu Frey. We're going Poliana Viana moneyline -139. Mario Bautista versus Benito Lopez. We're going to not bet this fight. I don't feel super confident in a winner either way. I do think Mario Bautista will probably win, but we're going to lay off that fight. Miranda Maverick versus Shayna Young. I think Miranda Maverick will absolutely win by finish. Like I said, I think it could be early, possibly first round. That is not yet available, so please check out the podcast social media pages Saturday morning so you can see what alternate lines we were able to grab before the fights begin. Speaking of alternate lines, Derek Minor versus Shayalan Nurdambiek. Fight to not go the distance is what I like in that one. Not yet available, so make sure you check out our social pages to see what we're able to grab that at. For the UFC main card, Grant Dawson versus Mark O. Madsen. I like Grant Dawson to win, but I want to see what over 1.5 rounds look like, so we're going to hold off until over 1.5 rounds is available. Tagir Ulanbekov versus Nate Maness. I like Tagir Ulanbekov moneyline -225. Chase Sherman versus Josh Parisian. Fight to not go the distance is what I like there, so I'll wait to see what that alternate line looks like. Neil Magny versus Daniel Rodriguez. I like Neil Magny, moneyline -115. And for our UFC main event, Marina Rodriguez versus Amanda Lemos. I like Marina Rodriguez, moneyline -225. Going into our parlay, we have the Homestyle Perfect Plate Parlay, Jake Hadley moneyline, Johnny Munoz moneyline, and Tagir Ulanbekov moneyline for +178. That wraps up all of our bets for this upcoming Saturday. Let's put our final word in for the podcast. As always, please bet responsibly. If you have a gambling problem, call your state's hotline. I'll be posting my verdict scorecard predictions prior to the event on social media for the podcast, as well as the alternate lines that we're waiting on. Please go follow at the Homestyle MMA Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and at Homestyle MMA Pod on Twitter. Check out the HomestyleMMAPodcast.podbean.com for additional information about the podcast. We're continuing to grow on social media. We're getting great interaction. Feel free to get involved on any posts. If you agree or disagree, please let me know. I would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe, like, comment, and review. Next week, we'll do a rapid recap of this past Saturday and look ahead to the highly anticipated pay-per-view UFC 281 Adesanya versus Pereira for the middleweight title fight. That is going to be an excellent pay-per-view. UFC 281 taking place November 12th. I can't wait to break that one down with you guys. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Till next time, this was Sean Van Buren on the Homestyle MMA Podcast. Y'all have a good one.